I never thought of myself as the kind of woman who would cheat. I believed in marriage, in loyalty, in all the things I had promised the day I stood at the altar. And for the first few years, I meant every word. But life has a way of twisting things, turning the person you once loved into a stranger, turning the vows you made into something distant and hollow. I wasn't looking for this. I wasn't searching for an escape. But when it happened, I didn't stop it. I let it happen. And I don't regret it. Nathan and I had been married for 5 years. At first, everything was perfect. We had the kind of love people envied, the kind of relationship that made others say, "You two are so lucky." And I believed it. I really did. But slowly things changed. Nathan changed. Or maybe I just started to see him for who he really was. The man who once held me close every night now barely acknowledged me. The man who used to call me beautiful now barely looked at me. I tried to fix it. I tried everything. Conversations turned into arguments, which turned into silence. And silence was worse. Because silence meant he had stopped caring that I was suffocating, and then there was him, Christopher. Nathan's father. It started so innocently. A conversation here, a glance there. Christopher was nothing like his son. Where Nathan was cold, Christopher was warm. Where Nathan dismissed me, Christopher listened. I had always liked him. He was charming, confident, the kind of man who could walk into a room and own it without trying. But I never saw him that way. Not at first, then one night, everything shifted. It was a family gathering at their house, the kind of thing I used to enjoy but now dreaded. Nathan barely spoke to me all night, too absorbed in his own world to even notice I was there. I felt invisible, forgotten. Christopher, on the other hand, noticed. He saw the way I sat there, pushing food around my plate, pretending to laugh at jokes I didn't hear. And when I got up to get some air, he followed. We ended up outside, just the two of us, standing in the dim light of the porch. The air was thick, warm, charged with something I couldn't name. I remember the way he looked at me, really looked at me, like he saw through the mask I had been wearing, straight into the loneliness I had been drowning in. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low. I should have said yes. I should have smiled and lied like I always did. But I didn't know, I whispered. He exhaled, shaking his head. "I see the way he treats you." I swallowed hard, staring at the ground. "I don't know when it got this bad," I admitted. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that made my heart stop. "You deserve better." I looked up, meeting his eyes, and suddenly the space between us felt too small. That was the moment everything changed. That was the moment I let it happen, but it didn't happen that night. No. That night we just stood there, lingering in a silence filled with unspoken things. I felt his presence beside me, steady and sure, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something that I had forgotten seen. A part of me wanted him to touch me, to close the distance, to break the loneliness that had been wrapping itself around me like a slow suffocation. But Christopher was careful. He didn't push. He didn't take advantage of the moment. He just stayed, and that made it worse, because when a man doesn't chase, when he doesn't try to take what he clearly knows he could, it makes you want it more. It makes you think about it long after the moment has passed. The following days were torture. Every time I saw him, I felt that moment between us hovering in the air, waiting. At dinner with Nathan's family, Christopher's eyes would meet mine across the table, unreadable, but I knew. He knew, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. I would replay our conversation in my head, wondering if I had imagined the tension, the pull. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. Then, one evening, I found myself alone with him again. Nathan had gone out for the night, some excuse about meeting friends, not that I cared anymore. I was in the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of wine, when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, and there he was. "Didn't expect to see you here," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Didn't plan to be," he admitted. "Just needed some air." We stood there, the silence stretching, the unspoken words thick between us. I should have left. I should have walked away. But I didn't, because for the first time in years, I felt alive, and I wasn't ready to let that go. I told myself I wouldn't let it happen. That no matter how much I felt the pull toward Christopher, no matter how much I craved the way he looked at me, really looked at me, I wouldn't cross that line. I had already let things go too far in my mind, but I wouldn't act on it. I wasn't that kind of woman. But desire has a way of eating at you, of making you question things you once believed were unshakable. It starts as a whisper, a thought you can push away. Then it grows. It follows you into the quiet moments, into the spaces between conversation, into the way you start to notice things you shouldn't. The way his hands move. The way his voice lowers when he speaks to you. The way his eyes linger just a second too long after that night in the kitchen. I couldn't stop thinking about him. It was wrong, I knew it was wrong, but knowing didn't stop it. It only made me want it more. Every time Nathan touched me, I flinched. Every time he kissed me, I felt nothing. And every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone else. Then came the moment that changed everything. Nathan was away on a business trip. He had barely said goodbye before leaving, barely glanced up from his phone when I told him to have a safe flight. It didn't hurt anymore. I had stopped expecting anything from him. That night, I went to his parents' house for dinner, like I always did when he was gone. His mother, as sweet as she was, had no idea about the storm brewing beneath the surface. She chatted about meaningless things, about neighbors and family updates, completely unaware of the way Christopher and I barely looked at each other. Or maybe we were just too good at hiding it after dinner. His mother excused herself to go upstairs, leaving Christopher and me alone in the dimly lit living room. I could feel his presence beside me on the couch, the warmth of him too close, too tempting. The TV was on, but I wasn't watching it. I was hyper-aware of every breath he took, of every shift in his posture. I saw the way you looked at me earlier, he said suddenly, his voice quiet but firm. My heart pounded. I kept my eyes on the screen. I don't know what you're talking about. He exhaled a short, amused breath. You do? Silenced that I should have gotten up. I should have ended this. But instead, I turned my head, and when our eyes met, I knew. There was no going back. I think about you, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. A muscle tightened in his jaw. You shouldn't, but I do. His hand brushed against mine, just barely, but it was enough. Enough to make my breath hitch, enough to make my entire body tense with the kind of anticipation I hadn't felt in years. For a moment, neither of us moved. We just sat there, inches apart, the weight of everything we weren't supposed to feel pressing down on us then. He stood. I should go, he said, his voice tight. I nodded, but I didn't want him to. He hesitated for just a second before turning and walking away, and that was how I knew I had already lost, but it didn't stop there. It couldn't. The next day, I woke up feeling restless, my mind still tangled in the previous night. I told myself to forget it, to move on, to pretend it had never happened. But I knew that was impossible. The moment had already rooted itself inside me, growing into something I couldn't ignore. That afternoon, I found myself texting him. Just a simple message, can we talk? No context, no explanation. I stared at the screen, waiting, my heart hammering. A few minutes passed, then my phone vibrated. Not a good idea, but he hadn't said no. I exhaled slowly, setting my phone down, forcing myself to focus on anything else. But all I could think about was him. The way he had looked at me, the way his hand had barely touched mine, and how even that tiny contact had set my entire body on fire. I wanted more. I needed more. I lasted another day before I saw him again. I was at the grocery store, moving through the aisles in a daze, lost in thought, when I turned a corner and almost walked straight into him. We both froze for a second. Neither of us spoke. Then he cleared his throat. Hey. I swallowed hard. Hey. His eyes flicked down to my hands, gripping the cart too tightly, then back up to my face. You okay? No, I'm fine, I lied. He nodded, but I could see the tension in his posture, the way he seemed to be struggling with something. Finally, he sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. This thing between us. I cut him off before he could finish. Do you want it to stop? His breath hitched. I saw his fingers flex at his sides, the muscles in his jaw tighten. Then, after a long pause, no, neither did I. I should have walked away. Right there, in that grocery store aisle, when he looked at me with that restrained tension in his eyes, when I asked him if he wanted it to stop and he said no. That was my last chance. My last moment to step back before the line was completely erased. But I didn't walk away. I couldn't. The moment stretched between us, thick and heavy, neither of us moving, neither of us breathing. His hands twitched at his sides like he was holding himself back, and I realized then that this hadn't just been building for me. It had been building for him. We left the store separately, but it didn't matter. The damage was already done. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the air conditioner, my body on fire from the memory of his voice, his eyes, the way he had stood so close but not touched me. I imagined what it would have been like if he had. If he had reached out, if he had pressed his palm against my cheek, if he had leaned in just enough that I could feel the heat of his breath. My stomach clenched, shame curling inside me. But it wasn't strong enough to stop the want. The next day, I found myself waiting for a text, a call, a sign that I wasn't the only one losing my mind. But nothing came. Hours passed, the silence stretching, and with every minute that ticked by, frustration built in my chest. Was I imagining it? Had I read too much into it? Had he changed his mind? I paced the living room, my heart hammering as I debated my next move. Then, before I could talk myself out of it, I grabbed my phone and typed 3 words. Where are you? I hit send before I could regret it. My hands were shaking as I set the phone down, staring at it like it might explode. Seconds passed. Then a minute. Then another. Just when I was about to throw my phone across the room, it vibrated, come outside. My breath caught. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my keys and rushed to the door, my pulse racing as I stepped out into the night. And there he was. Christopher was leaning against his car, hands in his pockets, watching me with an unreadable expression. The streetlight above cast shadows across his face, making him look even more dangerous than he already was. I swallowed hard, forcing my feet to move, closing the distance between us one careful step at a time. Neither of us spoke. Then, finally, he exhaled, shaking his head slightly. This is a mistake. I nodded. I know. He looked at me, really looked at me, and I felt stripped bare under his gaze. Tell me to leave, he said, his voice rough as I opened my mouth. No words came out. A slow smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. That's what I thought. I should have stopped him. I should have stepped back when he reached for me. But I didn't. His fingers brushed against my arm first, a featherlight touch that sent electricity shooting down my spine. Then, he moved closer, his warmth pressing into me, his hand sliding to the small of my back. My breath hitched. I felt his hesitation, the final sliver of restraint he had left. But when I didn't pull away, when I didn't tell him to stop, that restraint shattered. His lips were on mine before I could think, before I could even process what was happening. It wasn't soft. It wasn't gentle. It was desperate, raw, years of unspoken tension snapping all at once. My hands gripped his shirt, pulling him closer, my body molding against his like I had belonged there all along. The kiss deepened, his hands tightening on me, pressing me closer, like he was afraid I'd disappear. My mind was screaming at me to stop, to think about what I was doing, but my body wasn't listening then. Just as suddenly as it started, he pulled away. We were both breathing hard, standing too close, our bodies still magnetized toward each other. His jaw clenched, his hands curled into fists at his sides. This can't happen, he muttered. I swallowed, my head spinning. I know. But neither of us moved. Seconds passed, stretching between us, thick with tension, with the weight of what we had just done. I should have turned around and gone inside. I should have pretended like this was a mistake, like it hadn't meant anything. But when I looked at him, I knew this wasn't over. This was only the beginning. The next morning, I woke up with my phone still in my hand, the screen dark, the memory of last night burning in my mind. I replayed it over and over. The way his lips had felt, the way he had tasted, the way his hands had trembled just slightly when they held me. I had expected guilt to hit me, but it didn't. Instead, all I felt was more need, more hunger, more of the ache that had been growing inside me for months. For years, I wanted to see him again. I didn't have to wait long that afternoon. I was in the backyard watering the plants when I heard a car pull up. My pulse jumped before I even turned around. I knew it was him. I could feel it slowly. I turned. Christopher stood at the fence, his expression unreadable. We didn't speak. We just stared at each other across the space between us then. Finally, he said, "Tell me to leave." I couldn't, and that was how I knew this was only getting started. I should have told him to leave. I should have turned around, gone back inside, and pretended like none of this had ever happened. But I didn't. I stood there, staring at Christopher across the fence, feeling my pulse hammer in my throat. He was waiting for me to say something, to do something, to stop this before it went any further. But we both knew I wouldn't. I set the hose down, my hands trembling slightly, and took a slow step forward. He didn't move. He just watched me, his expression unreadable, his jaw tight, his fingers curled into fists at his sides like he was trying to hold himself back. I stopped just a few feet away from him, close enough to see the tension in his shoulders, the flicker of conflict in his eyes. He was fighting this just as much as I was. But the pull between us was stronger. Someone could see us, I whispered. His lips twitched, just slightly. "Then you should probably go inside." I should have. Instead, I reached for the latch on the gate and opened it the second it swung open. He stepped inside, closing it behind him, his movements slow, deliberate. My breath hitched as he took another step toward me, closing the space between us inch by inch. "This is dangerous," he murmured. "I know." His fingers brushed against my wrist, just barely, and my entire body lit up like a live wire. He exhaled sharply, his hand flexing like he was holding himself back, but I could see the way his control was slipping. "You have to tell me to stop," he said, his voice low, rough, but I couldn't. I tilted my head up, meeting his gaze, letting him see the truth written all over my face, and then he kissed me. It was different this time. The first time had been frantic, desperate, a collision of everything we had been holding back. But this was slow, deliberate, like he was memorizing the feel of me, like he wanted to savor every second. His hand slid to my waist, pulling me against him, and I melted into his touch, into the warmth of his body, into the sheer rightness of it. I didn't care about the consequences. I didn't care about anything except this moment, except him. We broke apart just long enough to breathe, our foreheads pressed together, our chests rising and falling in sync. His hands tightened on my waist, his grip almost bruising. "This is a mistake," he muttered. I closed my eyes. "Then why does it feel so right?" He didn't have an answer, or maybe he did, but neither of us wanted to say it. We didn't stop. We couldn't stop. Every moment without him felt unbearable. Every second apart felt like torture. We found excuses to see each other, small moments stolen in secret, conversations that meant nothing but felt like everything. And every time we were alone, the tension grew. Then, one night, everything changed again. Nathan was supposed to be out late. I had planned to spend the evening alone, trying to convince myself that this thing with Christopher had to end before we got caught. But then, just as I was pouring myself a glass of wine, my phone vibrated. "Come outside." My pulse jumped. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my sweater, slipped out the back door, and found him waiting for me in his car. The second I slid into the passenger seat, he reached for me, his hand finding mine, his grip tight. "We need to stop," he said, but there was no conviction in his voice. I turned to face him, my heart pounding. "Do you want to?" His jaw clenched. No, neither did I. And that was how I found myself in his bed that night, tangled in his sheets, his hands mapping every inch of me, his lips tracing every secret I had never spoken out loud. It was reckless, dangerous, the worst decision I had ever made, but it was also the best, and I wasn't ready to give it up. Not yet. I woke up before dawn, my body tangled with his, my heart pounding from something I couldn't name. His arm was draped over my waist, his breath steady against the back of my neck. For a brief moment, I let myself pretend this was real, that there were no consequences waiting for us outside this room. But reality always catches up. I carefully slid out of bed, moving as quietly as I could, grabbing my clothes from the floor. I had to get home before Nathan. I had to pretend like none of this had ever happened, but as I reached for the door, his voice stopped me. "Leaving already?" I turned, my stomach twisting. He was watching me, his expression unreadable. I hesitated. I have to. He sat up, running a hand through his hair. Do you regret it? I should have said yes. I should have lied, but I didn't. I met his gaze. No, his lips twitched, just slightly, and I knew this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning of our downfall. I drove home in silence, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The sky was still dark, the city asleep, but my mind was racing. My body still ached from his touch. My skin still burned where his lips had been, but the weight of what I had done settled over me like a suffocating fog. I had crossed the line. There was no going back. I told myself I would stop, that this was the last time, that I could walk away now before it spiraled further out of control. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. The house was quiet when I stepped inside. I moved carefully, my breath shallow, ear straining for any sign of Nathan. But he wasn't home yet. Relief flooded me, but it was short-lived. Because as I stood there in the dim light of the kitchen, staring at my reflection in the window, the truth hit me like a slap. It wasn't just about what I had done. It was about what I wanted to do again. The next few days were unbearable. I avoided Christopher, ignored his messages, forced myself to stay away. I convinced myself that if I could just create distance, this thing between us would fizzle out. But it didn't. It grew. The tension, the need, the unbearable ache of wanting something I knew I shouldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him. Every time Nathan touched me, I thought of him. It was a slow torture, a craving that wouldn't fade no matter how much I tried to drown it. Then everything fell apart. Nathan came home early one evening, his expression unreadable, his body tense in a way that sent alarm bells ringing in my head. I was in the kitchen, pretending to be lost in some mundane task, but I could feel his eyes on me. Where were you the other night? He asked suddenly, his voice too calm. My heart skipped. What do you mean? I mean, he said slowly, stepping closer. I came home late. You weren't here. I swallowed hard. I went for a drive. His eyes narrowed. At 2 a.m? I forced a casual shrug, my pulse hammering. Couldn't sleep. Silence. Heavy. Suffocating. Then he exhaled, running a hand through his hair. You've been acting different, he muttered. Distant. I turned back to the sink, gripping the counter to steady myself. I don't know what you're talking about. But I did. I felt his presence behind me, the weight of his stare pressing into my back. You sure about that? I forced myself to nod. Yeah. He didn't say anything else. Just stood there, watching, and in that moment I knew he knew, maybe not everything. Maybe not who. But he suspected. And that was enough to send a chill down my spine. I barely slept that night, my mind spiraling into panic, my body restless with the weight of my guilt. Morning came too fast, and as I stood in the bathroom staring at my reflection, exhaustion shadowed my face. I needed to end this. Now I picked up my phone, my fingers shaking as I typed out the words. We can't do this anymore. I hit send before I could change my mind. Minutes passed. Then my phone vibrated. Meet me. I hesitated. I should have ignored it. I should have let it go, but I didn't. An hour later, I found myself sitting across from Christopher in his car, my hands clenched in my lap, my stomach twisting with something I couldn't name. He was watching me, his expression unreadable, his fingers tapping restlessly against the steering wheel. This is getting dangerous, I whispered. It's been dangerous from the start, he murmured. I swallowed hard. Nathan knows something. He stiffened. Did he say anything? I shook my head. Not directly. But he's watching me. I can feel it. Christopher exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. We should stop. I nodded. We should. Neither of us moved then. He reached for me. It wasn't planned. It wasn't careful. It was raw, desperate, a final collision of everything we had been holding back. His lips crushed against mine, his hands tangling in my hair, pulling me closer, deeper, like he was trying to memorize the way I felt before it was too late. And maybe that's exactly what it was, because the second we pulled away, reality crashed back and I opened my mouth to say something, anything. But then my phone rang. Nathan. My breath caught. I turned the screen toward Christopher, and his expression darkened. Answer it. I hesitated, then pressed the phone to my ear.
Hey.
His voice was eerily calm. Where are you? I swallowed. Just out running errands. Silence. Then, come home. The line went dead. I turned to Christopher, my stomach twisting. Something's wrong.
He nodded, jaw tight.
Be careful. I didn't respond. I just got out of the car, my legs weak beneath me, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might break. The drive home was the longest of my life. When I pulled into the driveway, Nathan was waiting on the porch, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. My stomach dropped. I stepped out, forcing a smile. Hey, he held up a hand, stopping me then. In a voice so quiet it sent a chill down my spine, he said, I know. The world tilted. My breath caught.
What?
His jaw clenched. I know. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. Everything crashed down around me in that moment, and I knew this was the end.